Okay, so where is dopamine released in the human brain, right? In the brain. Well, it turns out that the monoamines, and we're going to see acetylcholine, always have a nucleus, sort of a source where the cell bodies are actually localized and found in clumps of gray matter called nuclei, right? In the brain stem, and dopamine is no exception. So dopamine, actually, there are two sort of primary brainstem nuclei that are the source of projections, the axons that'll leave the brainstem and then form synaptic connections with structures that are elsewhere in the brain, and form these sort of dopaminergic pathways, right? Basically, they're originating, in two distinct nuclei in the brain stem, and then their white matter projections, their axonal projections, are going to be heading out and forming synaptic connections with structures that are localized in other parts of the brain, and that's where they're going to release the dopamine, into synapses there. That's where the dopaminergic synapses will be localized. So if we look at this image, you can sort of see a cut, mid-sagittal slice right down the middle of a human brain, and I've indicated there's two, nuclei sources in the brainstem. One, the substantia nigra, which stands for black substance, and if you actually cut across the midbrain, horizontally like this, you actually see they look like eyebrows. They're like these kinds of thick, darkening, black, stained, kind of structures, and this is called the substantia nigra, and that projects forward into a set of subcortical nuclei that are interconnected with each other, that form specific circuits within themselves and with the cortex. So there's the cortex that's involved in sort of motor planning, motor execution. There's other areas of cortex that also feed into these circuits, but there's a lot that has to do with sort of, motor engagement and, behavior. There's information that will be signaled down through this set of subcortical nuclei and then come back via thalamus, because things, coming back to the thalamus, back to the cortex, go through thalamus, back into, one of the targets would be the precentral, precentral gyrus, the motor strip, and this is a set of subcortical structures called the basal ganglia that are involved in the timing of movement, sort of the initiation of movement, the stopping of movement, and so the circuits that go through the basal ganglia are involved in, accelerating movement, sort of like hitting the accelerator pedal and making you go, and also in kind of inhibiting or hitting the brakes, and slowing down movement, and the overall sort of timing of movements. So the basal ganglia, as we described earlier, right, is a complicated set of interconnected nuclei, and it involves some structures that are actually what we call striated. They're striped because there's cabling that's coming from the motor cortex, like white matter cables that are axons that are working their way through, and they kind of stripe it or striate it. So there's structures called the striatum, and the striatum is a target basically of the substantia nigra dopaminergic projections from the midbrain, from the brainstem. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this, so you can sort of see on this is a kind of a coronal slice of an actual human brain, and these are some of the components that make up the basal ganglia. So there is the caudate nucleus. It's right there by the ventricles. It sort of looks small there, but it's caudate. Caudate means tail. So it's this great big tail-like thing that extends forward and back. That's a component of the striatum. Then there's also these structures here, like there's this piece of gray matter right there. That's called the globus, the putamen, which is a nucleus. Putamen means husk, so it's the outer husk of it. And then in here is the globus pallidus. This is what's called the pale globe, and you can see it's a little paler right in that spot, and it's on both sides. There's a caudate. And so the pathway, the dopaminergic pathway that starts in the striatum, starts in the substantia nigra, in the brainstem, it works its way forward into the striatum, And it's going to be, we call this the nigra because it's starting in the substantia nigra in the brainstem striatal pathway. And this we're going to see, this nigrostriatal pathway is a very critical dopaminergic pathway, particularly for the timing and the initiation and the stopping of movements. So we'll learn that the degeneration, for example, of the substantia nigra, that dopaminergic projection into the basal ganglia can result in a disorder known as Parkinson's disease, which has lots of movement sort of consequences. The other brainstem source of dopaminergic projection sort of forward in the brain is what's called the ventral tegmental area. And this is in the sort of meso region, the mesencephalic region of the brain stem. So the source of these pathways that come out of the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, this dopaminergic nucleus in the brainstem, they both those pathways names start with meso, and they have a number of targets. So typically these meso pathways are actually dopaminergic pathways are involved in sort of motivated behaviors and emotional behavior, impulsive behaviors and things like that. Well, they're going to project into limbic structures, including the hypothalamus, including a component of the basal ganglia that's up here in the frontal lobe, which is where the caudate nucleus and the putamen sort of come together. As you work your way forward in the brain, the caudate and the putamen sort of merge into this nucleus in the front called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is a major target of this we call mesolimbic, dopaminergic pathway. Again, originating in the VTA, in the ventral tegmental area, dopaminergic nucleus in the brainstem, but then projecting forward into like the hypothalamus, the nucleus accumbens, other sort of limbic structures that are located more towards the forebrain and the frontal lobe. And then the other meso pathway that's critical for in terms of dopamine is the cortical targets of the VTA. And so these are going to be actually in the frontal lobe, in the prefrontal cortex. And so we call this particular pathway, which originates again, for example, in the VTA in the brainstem, it projects forward and makes synaptic connection and releases dopamine in prefrontal cortex. And so that's called the mesocortical pathway. So we have the nigrostriatal pathway coming out of the substantia nigra in the brainstem, projecting into the striatum, right? Like, aspects of the part of the caudate and the putamen, components of the basal ganglia that are striped. And then we have two pathways originating in the VTA in the brainstem. And their axons project out and release dopamine in limbic targets, like the hypothalamus and the nucleus accumbens, and that's going to be the mesolimbic pathway, and then also directly into the frontal lobe, into areas of the prefrontal cortex that's going to be involved in sort of motivated behaviors, and that's the mesocortical pathway.